Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 5 of Principles of Entrepreneurship. This week, we're going to be talking about business models and the lean startup methodology. Before we start, we'll just have a look at the topics or the areas that we're going to cover this week. So firstly, we're going to look at the importance of developing and testing a business model, how to create a business model, the difference between a startup and a standard business, and then we're also going to cover how to apply the lean startup method. So hopefully you'll recognize this diagram. I know I introduced you to this last week. Here we have the development process as we talked about in class. And we're now moving from the design thinking part into the lean startup part of the course. And generally when you had completed, or if you had completed design thinking and done some of the activities that were discussed last week and actually created some kind of concept that you test with your users, you would have a form of a low fidelity prototype or several prototypes. We'd now be moving into the lean startup process, which at the end of this, you would have an MVP or a minimal viable product. If your team has struggled with your ideas and actually trying to come up with some kind of product for your business venture, there's a couple of additional canvases that are available on Blackboard that are posted, which are about documenting your prototype vision and breaking that down. So please access those and have a go at those with your team. So as noted, we're now moving from the design thinking aspect of the course into the lean startup part. And there's a few little differences in moving from the design part. And you'll see here the comparison across a number of different areas of design versus lean startup. So for example, the purpose of design thinking and the prototype that we develop at the end is really about the testing the feasibility and desirability of the solution. Whereas with the minimal viable product as part of the lean startup, we're looking for validations at all different levels of the design. So feasibility, desirability, and viability, and trying to do that with as little effort and probably as little cost and a maximum amount of learning. So we're still doing this iterative process of discovery or thinking about the customer, doing some ideation and then evaluating or testing, but we're moving to a more holistic way of looking at it. You can see here the focus of design is presentation to decision-making bodies and stakeholders. So you would probably want to have a concept to be able to get funding for the next phase. Whereas in the the lean startup phase, what we're looking for is some sort of product that would be good enough for a launch and an interaction with real customers, really just to test the product to make sure that the concept that you've got is actually going to work in the real world. So there's a couple of differences, but again, it's on that same spectrum and on that same process that we talked about last week. So this week, we're going to deep dive into the business models. What is a business model? Well, a business model articulates the logic and provides data and other evidence that demonstrates how a business creates and delivers value to customers. It also outlines the architect of revenues, costs and profits associated with a business enterprise and what is delivering that value. The different elements that need to be determined in business model design are listed on the screen, and you can see in that diagram what they are there. There's 6 of those. In essence, a business model embodies nothing less than the organizational and financial architecture of a business. And business models actually only became popular in the early 2000s. This was due to the emerging knowledge economy, the growth of the internet, e-commerce, outsourcing and offshoring of many business activities, as well as the restructuring of the financial services industry around the world. The way in which companies started to make money was also very different to that from the industrial era or previous generations of business. That is, the enterprises in the past had simply packed their technology and intellectual property into a product which they had sold, either as a discrete item or a bundled package. However, this was changing during this time. The growing use of access of computers also allowed low-cost financial modelling, and that facilitated the exploration of alternative assumptions about revenue and cost around a business. People began to also explore how they could capture value from delivering information services that users often expected to receive without charge. So it allowed individuals and businesses easy access to vast amounts of data and information, and customer power increased as comparison shopping was also made easier. So there was a lot of changes in the business world. In 2010, when Thies wrote this first study on, or first known obvious research study in academia, there really wasn't any academic literature on the development of business models. Business models were assumed. Apparently, there were no puzzles really about how to design a business up until that point. It was simply assumed that if value was delivered, customers would pay for it. So putting aside probably the most obvious public goods and free rider issues to one side, business models were quite simply redundant up until this point, because producers, suppliers could create and capture value simply through disposing their output at competitive market prices. So business models were something at that stage of being quite new. The lack of knowledge about business model development was particularly problematic at this time, though, for entrepreneurs. According to conventional wisdom, the first thing every founder would do or should do is create a business plan, a static document that describes the size of an opportunity, the problem to be solved, and the solution that the new venture will provide. Typically, it includes a 5-year forecast for income, profits, and cash flow. A business plan is essentially a research exercise written in isolation at a desk before an entrepreneur has even begun to build a product. And the assumption is that it's possible to figure out most of the unknowns of a business in advance before you raise money and actually execute an idea, which is just not realistic. This outdated mode of thinking was quickly replaced for entrepreneurs with the concept of business model development. A business model is much more generic than a business strategy. You do need to couple the business model along with the business strategy to protect whatever competitive advantage results from the design and implementation of your business model. It is really a core thing to help you set up and understand the value creation for your business, and to figure out revenue streams and costs, and actually understand how all of this is going to come together, how it's going to work, where your competitors are, and what your advantage is going to be. The core business model has 4 key elements: the customer value proposition, technology and operations management, the go-to-market plan, and a profit formula. Along with the recognition that business models were not business strategies, that they were an articulation of the value proposition and the revenue approach, it was also recognised that entrepreneurs were better placed to design their business using a business model. The business model was a tool as well to explore and test ideas and assumptions that would make it clearer whether a startup enterprise could actually be successful. So from the research at the time, we'd now learnt at least 3 things about entrepreneurial endeavours and business models. So first of all, business plans rarely survived the first contact with customers. That was something that, when actually put to the test, a lot had been invested by that stage, and the business strategy would possibly fail. Number two, no one besides venture capitalists and possibly the late Soviet Union required 5-year plans to forecast complete unknowns. These plans, being developed in the way that they had, were generally fiction, and dreaming them up was almost always a waste of time. The third thing was startups were not smaller versions of large companies. They did not, or they do not, unfold in accordance with the master plans that are developed during a large company's planning process. The ones that ultimately succeed generally go quickly from failure to failure, all the while adapting, iterating on, and improving their initial ideas as they continually learn from customers. One of the critical differences is that while existing companies execute a business model, startups look for one. They're searching for a new model. This distinction is at the heart of the lean startup approach. It shapes the lean definition of a startup, a temporary organisation designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. So Alex Osterwalder wrote his PhD on the topic of business models, and the actual PhD, if you want to look it up, is called Business Model Ontology. He later went on to write a book for practitioners and create what is now the well-known version of the Business Model Canvas, which you can see here on the screen. This has a number of key elements that you explore as you are trying to develop your business model. So just remember that it is just a template, but a template that gives you ideas for the key areas that you need to address in developing your business model. We also have a slightly different version that has been developed recently out of some work by Michael Lurick. And this is in his resource, a book called Design Thinking for Business Growth. It's a slightly different business model canvas, but it's targeted specifically at startups. So feel free to also look at that and use that as an alternative business model canvas. So every business plan begins with a set of assumptions. It lays out a strategy that takes those assumptions as a given and proceeds to show how to achieve the company's vision. Many of the assumptions haven't been proven at this stage and may actually, in fact, be erroneous. These are what we would call leaps of faith. It is therefore the startup's goal to test these kinds of assumptions quickly and hopefully cheaply as possible. Acting if these assumptions are true is a classic entrepreneur superpower. If they are true, tremendous opportunities await. However, if they are false, the startup risks total failure. So you must aim to test these assumptions with sufficient rigor to support your confidence as an entrepreneur. It's important that you test and try lots of different experiments to ensure that your assumptions are actually true, correct, or on the money. You may find that there are existing things called analogues or antilogues that you can observe to help you understand whether your hypothesis or your assumptions are actually correct. Venture capitalist Randy Komisar, who wrote the book Getting to Plan B, explained in his book, and he used an example of a Walkman being an analogue for Steve Jobs whilst he was exploring the iPod and the iPod development. Steve needed to answer a critical question in his hypothesis about whether people would actually listen to music in a public area, public place using headphones. And this might seem like a really silly or a nonsense question today. Of course they will, we know that. But back then it wasn't so certain. And when Sony asked that question, when they developed the Walkman, they didn't actually have an answer. So Steve Jobs then had to understand as his second part, which he was not sure about, was whether people would be willing to pay for this service, whether they would be prepared to pay for music and be able to use it on the go. So Napster at the time was the antilogue of his theory. Napster was popular because people were apparently, or in his questioning, weren't willing to pay for music. And that analogue then led him to address his business strategy in a particular way, and he had to test it further before he proceeded. He had to make a decision about how he was going to actually market and sell his product. But he actually believed, despite Napster, that people would pay for music. He made what we would call a leap of faith, and it was lucky that he was correct. We now have all of the wonderful products from Apple. So the main readers for today's or this week's session and workshop are on Blackboard. You can see them there. We are primarily looking at the Lean Launchpad method, which uses business model design as an agile discovery, test and learn approach. So that's what we'll be looking at. So please grab them out and have a look at those. First of all, we need to be clear on what a startup actually is, and that a startup is different from any other kind of business. It's actually a temporary business that is looking to find a model that is scalable. It makes sense that the tools that you would apply to traditional businesses then would not be necessarily appropriate for startups. They actually need their own tools. At its heart, a startup is actually a catalyst that transforms ideas into products. As customers interact with products, they generate feedback and data, and the feedback is both qualitative and quantitative. The products that startups build are really just experiments, and businesses are learning how to build a sustainable business out of those experiments. This is what a startup is. The Lean Startup method has 3 core steps that are iterative and look remarkably like the design process. So we have here, you have an idea, you build it out, which creates some kind of test product. You do some sort of evaluation or measurement, which gives you data that enables you to learn, and then you go back to your idea. And here is the design process, which is very much a similar sort of thing where you're discovering, inventing, and evaluating. So these 2 types of processes are very similar and complementary. So what is the Lean Startup method? The entrepreneur translates his or her vision into falsifiable BM hypothesis. So business model hypothesis, your assumptions are turned into statements about what you believe to be possible. And then you test these hypotheses with a series of minimal viable products, or MVPs. These use things like what we call a smoke test. They're really things to just get a feel for whether you're on the right track. You're trying to determine whether your statements are correct, and they often don't require a fully developed MVP. They may actually have things that are just place markers or things that can simulate potential buyers actually showing interest in your product or purchasing your product. An MVP represents the smallest set of activities needed to disprove. And again, falsifiable hypothesis, or being able to have a falsifiable hypothesis, means that you are looking to disprove the hypothesis. You need to then look and see at the outcome outside of those tests, whether you should persevere if your hypothesis has been not proven, but you feel that it's valid. If it hasn't been, if it's invalidated, then you might want to pivot and revise your actual business model, or you can choose to do nothing and potentially close the business or discontinue the idea, which is the perish concept. If all of the initial key assumptions are validated, then you have a value proposition market fit, and you can start scaling and building your company. But rarely does that happen as simply as that. So The lean startup process has a number of steps if we wanted to actually just build it out and go through the logic of it. So at step one, you're developing a vision, and you need this at a high level before you can actually create a business model hypothesis. You will be looking at a problem that you want to address and developing a potential solution for that problem. You'll also be probably developing some other tools or concepts through an ideation process. And you could probably go back to the design thinking and look at the ideation process of actually how you could develop that. Then you move on to step two, which is translating the vision into the hypothesis. So having developed the vision, you then need to translate it into those falsifiable business model hypotheses. A business model should involve an integrated array of distinctive choices specifying the unique customer value proposition and how it will configure whatever activities that are going to be done in the business to actually deliver that value. You also want to be able to see what is the cash flow formula and revenue that can be developed. After you have done that, you specify the types of tests that you want to do to assess the validity of your hypotheses, and you want to maximize the learning that you're doing in comparison to the amount of effort that you actually have to put into the process. So you want to learn early whilst it's low fidelity or cheap. So fail whilst it's cheap, fail early, fail often, and learn from that process. You can use some traditional processes like market research for this or focus groups, but often the process is much simpler and actually just talking to customers. After you do that, you go into step 4, which is prioritizing tests. You need to then decide which tests you want to do, how to sequence them, and which ones are the most important, because you may not have unlimited funds or capability to be able to test all of your different assumptions. So you would actually want to be checking to see, for example, whether your idea has already got a patent against it. You may actually want to go and investigate that yourself or invest in the money to have a patent search done, which is typically about $2,000. Step 5 is then learning from the tests that you have conducted, and you evaluate the feedback that you've got from the MVP, and you'll be looking for also checking to see that you're not getting false positives or false negatives, which are also issues that could happen to you going through this process. There are a number of other sources of error that could occur, as well as your own cognitive bias that can occur in this process. Step 6, that's when you'll then, based on whether your hypotheses have been validated or not, you'll be making a decision about whether you want to persevere with the existing MVP, whether you want to actually change direction, or whether you want to close. These things, no one of these is right or wrong. This is merely the process for you to be able to learn and actually develop quickly or change direction while it's still cheap, and quite possible for you to do that. The pivot is one of the things that I know has become quite popular in recent times, or the terminology of a pivot. Basically, the pivot comes into place if your test around your MVP rejects the hypothesis, or if it validates the hypothesis, but there's other feedback that might indicate that there's further opportunities somewhere else or greater opportunities somewhere else. You might then choose to actually pivot based on that. You need to change, you may consider changing some business model elements whilst leaving some still the same. All of this is possible, but should be considered after you've done some of those tests. So the Lean Launchpad is a program that's actually run out of Stanford by Steve Blank. One of the readers that you've got available to you on Blackboard is focused on the program that Steve runs. And this program is an intense program that puts students through a targeted incubator process focused on understanding the business value proposition, testing and pivoting the business during a contained set of classes. I'm going to use this to talk to you primarily about the key steps in this, so you may wish to follow this in your own project. The first part is, so there's 4 parts to this process. You've got customer discovery, customer validation, customer creation, and company building. And these are all part of the process that is followed in the Lean Startup approach. So the Lean Launchpad uses the business model canvas, so feel free to use this in your approach as well as the standard thing. So the first bit is looking to actually understand whether you have a product market fit, whether the customer actually is looking for a product that is the thing that you're suggesting. What is the value proposition? So that is the first thing that you'll be doing using the business model canvas. You need to work out how you think you'll be able to make money from your idea. So you'll be looking at the revenue streams. You then also explore who your key partners are, because developing any kind of startup, it's rare, if not, I think, highly unusual for a startup to not have other partners. They actually usually exist within an ecosystem, an innovation ecosystem that is often created by the entrepreneur. So you would need to explore who are your key partners and how can they work with you. Then you'll be looking at the cost structure. So what is it actually going to cost you to run this business? And is it actually going to make a profit? So finally, all of these elements come together to address those 3 key elements I know we have talked about previously, which is feasibility, desirability, and viability. These elements are all covered in the business model canvas. Entrepreneurs often focus on the first question in this statement here. So can a product be built? But they generally fail to correctly address the market risk and the business sustainability risk. This is potentially the greatest risk to everyone in this course as well. We shouldn't be thinking about whether the product can be built. We will work that one out. But really, should we build this product? And can we build some kind of sustainable way or business around the products and services that you're going to couple? So this is generally the most common areas where startups fail. And you can see here that a large number of them are actually due to problems with the business model development. So there was no market need is the first one. Pricing cost issues, you've got, or there was a lack of a business model. There was a lack of a business model need. That's another one. They didn't pay attention to their customers. They ignored their customers. The pilot has gone bad. The financing, there was a problem with financing, or they failed to pivot when they actually had an opportunity or an understanding of something that needed to be changed about their MVP. They didn't actually pivot. So these are all things that need to be considered by new entrepreneurs. And the Lean Startup model is actually, or the Lean Startup Launchpad is meant to help you address these. So it's also not always the fault of the founder in why a business fails. So there's a couple of different mistakes that are quite common. First one is to fail to engage the right stakeholders. As I said, an innovator or an entrepreneur rarely does this on their own. They really need to have the right environment and the right people around them to ensure that they are successful. And the other one is where they've moved or rushed into an opportunity without actually testing to make sure it's the right time and place and the right environment. It's really important to do customer interviews and research. If you don't do that, you're going to be in considerable trouble probably further along. And unfortunately, many entrepreneurs who actually say that they do lean startup, they still don't necessarily include all of the different components in the way that they operate or their method. So it's really important that you get the customer feedback on your concept. Problem definition. That was one of the things I pointed out as well last week, that you really do need to get the problem definition correct, conduct rigorous interviews with potential customers, and resist the temptation to pitch a solution or tell them what the answer should be. You're actually looking for them to uncover the problems, not tell them how to fix it. Solution development. Once priority customer segments are identified and you've gained a deep understanding of their unmet needs, brainstorm a range of solutions. Prototype iteration and testing continue until the dominant design emerges. And this is also part of the design process. Same principles that we talked about last week. Solution validation. To evaluate, run a series of MVP tests. Unlike the prototype review sessions, you want with the MVP to put a product in the hands of real customers and actually get them using the product to see how they feel about the product and also whether they would pay for it. So we'll just go through the steps now for each of the lean startup process. So first of all, framing the hypothesis. There's two parts to testing your assumptions and actually developing your hypothesis. So you need to have a value hypothesis, and this will test whether a product or service really delivers value to the customers when they're actually using it. And the other one is a growth and measurement hypothesis, which tests how new customers will discover a product and service and whether they'll pay for it, essentially. So using the business model canvas, you basically, for most of these elements, you're guessing. You're guessing at the different segments around key partners and activities, what your value proposition is, but you're documenting those guesses as hypotheses, or assumptions for each area. You will need to have a look at each of the questions that are there to be answered in the business model canvas, and you can see that there are a number of those in each segment that you would need to address. You can actually use the business model canvas as a milestone assumption or progress table. Milestones, whilst you're doing this, are critical. So even though we're using an iterative or agile approach, that doesn't mean we don't have a plan or some sort of approach. You want to be able to test your assumptions at specific points in the process. You want to also make sure that you don't overdo this, so try to be objective about which ones are prioritized for it. And then once you've tested assumptions, and if they've worked out or not, you need to move on and test further ones. You should only execute, actually, as in build out, once you've been able to validate those assumptions and make sure that you are on the right track. You can use the business model canvas to then, therefore, test some of these and actually plan this out. So, for example, it can be not just a single static canvas. It could be something that's used week after week as you're actually going through the process and testing your hypothesis. So you can see here that we've got it displayed as a weekly scorecard. Here's an example of how you could capture some of the outputs in a milestone assumption table. So you can see on the first line there that we've got in the customer discovery phase, we're saying that there might be a hypothesis that we've got in that we want to test. X has a problem with or needs Y. Their pains and gains are a particular thing. they're unhappy with the existing solutions because of some reason. All of these things we would document, and then we would note in there the types of interviews, the types of tests that we would like to perform to actually see if that is valid. So here is an example of 42 interviews with startups, and then we might complement that with secondary data. So actually using data to examine our hypotheses. And then at the end of that, you would note whether it was validated or not, and whether you want to continue on or change direction. And you could do this at each step in the actual process. Another way to do this is actually using a template like this, such as a progress board. This one's also available on Blackboard in the Lean Startup Resources area. Also available is a test card that you can then use to test your assumptions and make sure that you have correctly unpacked the assumption and how you want to evaluate it. The second step is customer discovery. So as noted in the previous step, you're going to want to test or validate some of your assumptions. So here you'll want to do things like 10 to 15 interviews a week. In the process of the Lean Launchpad startup, they do actually insist that you do 10 to 15 interviews per week and then present the results back in class. So it's a very intense program. You have to identify your starting niche and then also your ultimate market. And this is a bit of a tricky thing because we see that innovators generally follow a predictable curve, which is the yellow curve shown on the screen there, which is an S curve, and that's usually the adoption process. And but also there's a problem that many entrepreneurs face, which is the chasm between your early adopters, the people who are enthusiastic about your product or service, and then the main core market that will actually adopt your product. And this is something that you need to actually have a strategy for to cover. You'll also need to be thinking about these aspects of your market. So there's three core things: the TAM, the SAM, and the SOM. The TAM is the total addressable market, and it's basically the total market demand for a product or service, the total possible full bandwidth of what's possible. It's the maximum amount of revenue a business could possibly generate by selling their product or service in a specific market. It's usually something to be able to estimate a business's potential for growth, but may actually be generally overestimated. The second one is the SAM, or the serviceable addressable market. And due to the limitations of your business model, you will not likely be able to service the full total addressable market. This is more likely to be focused around a smaller subsection that may be more targeted, depending on what your product actually, how it fits in the market. And then the final one is the SOM, the serviceable obtainable market. So unless you're a monopoly, you most likely can't capture even 100% of your serviceable addressable market or observable market. You would find it's almost completely impossible to convince an entire market to only buy your product and service, but it has happened. And that's why it's crucial to also measure your serviceable obtainable market to determine how many customers would realistically benefit from buying your product or service. And the SOM is most useful for businesses to determine short-term growth targets. So here's an example of one that I had for my business, Spark Tank. You can see here that the TAM is the collaborative software market, which is a market of $53 billion potentially. The area that I'm really focused on is idea and innovation management, which is a much smaller market, or part of that market, which is around 3.5 billion or expected to be by 2027. My specific focus, however, is the idea generation part of that market rather than innovation management. And that's really a market of around 900 million. Okay, so that was a way that I have applied it for my own business model. You also then need to consider a number of other factors. So uncertainty about solution as well as brand equity can really affect the venture, as well as customer relationships and other sources. So in comparison to managers in established corporations, entrepreneurs face much bigger marketing challenges when it comes to actually getting their market fit. You often need to have a go-to-market plan which specifies how a new venture will address the challenges. And the plan will focus on a number of things like what mix of direct channels you will use, what indirect channels, prospects, etc. How will you configure and deliver products? Are you going to provide after-sale service, and so on? Is there any margin that your channel partners will require? Are you going to grant exclusive distribution rights with anyone? You'll also need to consider the expected lifetime value of a customer and what an average customer acquisition cost would be. So the CAC and the LTV will need to also be addressed. You'll want to look at what is there a mix, for example, of free and paid demand generation in whatever product that you're potentially putting together? Are you going to be using things like mass market or targeted marketing? Are you going to give product samples? Are you going to have a freemium model? What is your pricing going to be? All of these things you need to think about to be able to understand your customer and make sure that there is a product market fit. Also, though, if a venture is fundamentally using a particularly new product, you're going to find it even more important to address that chasm between the early adopter and the mainstream customer segments. And then you're really going to have to target some of these things to be able to ensure that your product does actually make it across that, that growth curve. So here is the product market fit. And generally we use the value proposition canvas to be able to unpack that. And you can see here that the value proposition canvas, or the two parts to it, which I'll show you in a minute, covers two parts of the business model. So the customer segments and the value proposition. And by aligning those two, you can actually see if you've got a product market fit. Use the value proposition canvas to ensure that it fits with your target segment and that your value proposition actually is appropriate for the target segment. And it's an iterative process of testing experiments to ensure that you've understood the assumptions and whether they're valid or not. So here is the value proposition canvas, and you will see that it's depicted here with the square to highlight the value map, which generally aligns to the value proposition part, or the key value proposition on your canvas. And then you've got the customer profile. And so with this, you're actually looking to understand what are the pains that your customer have, what are the obstacles or the problems that they have, what are the potential gains, what opportunities, I guess you'd say, that there are for an improved experience or a process. And you're also looking at what are the customer jobs, so the tasks or the activities that they need to do that your product or service is actually going to help them with. On the value map, you're then trying to map back to those pains and gains and the tasks what are the possible pain relievers? So what are the things that your product might be able to create or support them to overcome the pains that they're experiencing or the obstacles? Similarly, with the game creators, how are you going to leverage or enhance the opportunities that are there from the gains part of the customer profile? And then finally, the products and services that you'd be offering to actually address the jobs that they're doing. So these things, when they come together, you're comparing them to see or make sure that there's an actual fit between the values that you're intending to provide to the customer and the actual things that they need. So sometimes it's easier to convert that into a statement. So the way that you would do this is you would use this sort of phrasing that we have here on the screen. So whatever your product or service is going to be called helps whatever your customer segment is who want to do a particular job by, and you would want to say something like reducing, increasing, creating, so some kind of verb action word, and then look for one of their pains. And then again, with the alternative and another verb to be helping with a customer gain. You can also go further and actually look at any competing value propositions and compare it to another business or another organisation who may be offering something similar or what their current offering is. So here is the best way to do it according to the Lean Startup method. So do interviews. Interviews are one way of definitely doing it. You can also experiment or use some of the other methods we've talked about. You need to understand how to conduct an interview appropriately. And here on the screen are some various different tools that you can use. These are all available in the slide deck for you to examine. These are recordings from Steve Blank's course to show you how some of the other startups have actually tackled some of this and how you conduct interviews. The core process for conducting interviews has 5 steps. The first step is to identify the problem that you want to learn about. You then need to identify the people who are experiencing that problem. Figure out what you're going to ask them before you go there, and make sure that you're not leading them with some kind of question where you're giving them the solution and then saying, is it okay? You actually want them to tell you about the problem and how it occurs and how they overcome it. Do not sell your solution. You're actually then reducing the effectiveness of this process altogether. You may as well not do it. Make sure that you're actually listening to the people and hearing what they're telling you. Then conduct the interview. It's a conversation. It shouldn't be a script that you follow and that you tick questions. That's a survey. An interview is a conversation where you're listening to them to hear their stories and understand their perspective. As it says there, talk less, listen more. It would be good for you to also practice some of the empathy skills that we went through last week in the design thinking lecture. Finally, debrief, iterate, and implement any changes that you see are necessary to your business model. From that, you might develop a persona or an archetype of your customer. This is usually something that you'll give them a name, and you might even find a picture of someone who might represent them. You'll give them, you'll identify their age, maybe their title or the type of role that they have in a business or the type of activities that they're doing. You'll look to see how they buy what it is, when they buy it, what matters to them, what motivates them to actually interact with your product or service. Who do they listen to? Who are their influences? And maybe draw out even an experience map to understand how that all comes together for your product. So here's an example of a process that was quite successful for the village laundry service. So this was a startup that Akshay Mayre spotted. So in India, washing machines are very expensive, and few people actually have them in their homes. Usually people hand wash their clothing at home or pay Adobe to take them to the nearest river, wash them, bang them against rocks to clean them, and then hang them out to dry. And all of this takes between 2 and 7 days to achieve it. So Akshay spotted an opportunity for making laundry services available to people who previously couldn't afford them. He joined the village laundry service and began a series of experiments to test his business assumptions. So for his first experiment, he put a commercial washing machine on a pickup truck and parked it on a street in Bangalore. He encouraged people to hand over their laundry and then took it off site, washed it and brought it back to his customers by the end of the day. The washing machine on the truck was really just for show. It was to somehow advertise what he was doing. He repeated the experiment for a week, parking the truck on different streets and talking to his customers to find out more about them. He wanted to know how to encourage people to come back to the truck and whether cleaning speed mattered. Did the level of cleanliness matter? What people asked for when they handed over their clothes. He found that although people were happy to hand over their clothes, they were nervous of the truck and thought that Akshay may actually be going to drive away with their clothes and then never come back. So there was a trust element. So the solution was to build a more substantial mobile cart that looked like a street kiosk. Other interesting feedback was that customers often wanted their clothes ironed and were willing to pay double the price to get their laundry back in 4 hours rather than in 24 hours. As a result of these experiments, the village laundry service created booths measuring 6 by 6 feet that use modern washing methods such as good quality detergents, and they're highly efficient using front load washing machines. The booths are operated by an entrepreneur who is trained and mentored by the village laundry service. And this allows lower income individuals to generate additional income, to be self-sufficient and to improve their lives. So by growing through the small kiosks, the village laundry service has also been able to start shops literally anywhere, just like the neighborhood Dobie. Compared with standalone laundry services or high-end laundry shops that charge by the garment, washing, drying and ironing at a village laundry service comes at around 50 rupees for a kilogram, meaning it is then also widely affordable for most people. So that's a great example of how a concept then was tested as an MVP in place to see what were the things that were working and the things that were working against it. And as they learned from that process, they pivoted. They continually changed and adjusted their strategy. So really important that you talk to 10 to 15 customers a week, understand your user or buyer, their wants, their needs, their behaviors, and figure out why a current solution to whatever the problem is doesn't already exist, because this might be also a determining factor in why anyone previously has failed, and you would certainly want to know about that. So step 3, use MVPs. So the next step is ensure that you have continual revisions to the MVP based on customer discovery. So here's an example of one of the startups that are in the Lean Launchpad program. And we can see here that over a week, they were able to very quickly put together a very rough prototype, but a prototype that would work in place. This is actually the Carrot bot. And you can see here that on the Wednesday that they've started doing drawings of what it is that they're going to construct. By Saturday, they've started putting together a build based on diagrams. by Tuesday, they're able to actually go out into the field and actually potentially launch. Here we have the Carrot Bot in a week's time, actually out in field and being able to be tested to see functionally why it works or where it doesn't, and also any other issues that are going to be with someone using it. So these are the sorts of things you need to be thinking about doing. So you can obviously do a wireframe of an MVP. You can also take video footage, take photos of people actually trying to perform the task with your MVP. You should then analyze the findings, and then you could even put together some video footage to compare and discuss with the rest of your team what's actually been happening, so that you can try to analyze and understand how to improve or overcome the problem that's in your MVP. Really important, physical prototypes do help. If your concept is something that's digital, coming up with a paper prototype is very good. But if you've got something that is a physical prototype, even just coming up with something that is very crude, but asking people how and where they would use it and putting it in their hand can make a big difference in understanding the size, the nature of what it is that they're going to be doing with your product. Step 4, constantly reflect on your learning. This is one of the most important things about doing this kind of work, is the reflection, the thinking about what's happening, absorbing those feedbacks, and then trying to make some kind of iteration or translation of what that is that you've heard. We want to know what we thought, what we did, what we found, what's next as the lesson learned from this product or this project. And this is essentially the last step of the Lean Startup, Lean Launchpad. Finally, you can use learning cards as part of this process as well. And these are all really important tools for you in your assessment. So if you manage to use these and then include them in your assessment, I think you'll be streets ahead. So make sure you download some of these tools. This is on Blackboard as well, and document your learning as you progress through your activities. So finally, the process. Here we have what we've just gone through. So in summary, we hypothesize using the business model canvas. Then you prioritize those hypotheses and design tests around them. Then you run your tests with MVPs, capture the learning that you've got in there, and then decide which way you're going to go, whether you're going to pivot, whether you're going to continue on in your existing direction, so persevere, or whether you're actually going to stop it altogether. And that's it for this week's lecture. Look forward to seeing you all in class on Tuesday. Make sure you check out Blackboard to see what activities and what things you need to bring to class. See you then.